Yeah.
Good. Very good.
I
Great.
will announce it to our guests on at the end of this one.
Yeah,
then.
of course.
Deshika, could you start the Facebook Live, please?
Yes.
Hello, Paolo. How are you?
Good morning.
Just
Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon. No.
Yes, yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are
Thank you for inviting me in this.
really very for the first time, although you have been for quite some time in our board.
Yeah.
It is the first time we face each other, although through this.
Yeah, virtually.
It's really a pleasure.
Mm.
So we will just start in time. So we still have 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the list of guests. I think that it could be an idea to send it to you. I think it should be in our. We should have the list in our.
Yeah, I
right
will.
Events.
I can do it. It's.
I have a printed list here.
Oh, you have a printed list.
But I
Okay.
think,
So,
yeah, of course, I do understand. I think that we have some dozens of people, which is, I mean,
okay,
we have more than the usual number. I think it is
Good.
thanks to you.
share.
It is.
Okay. Christophe. Okay, Christophe, I will just share it with your email.
Okay. So we'll look at my mails.
Sorry for this.
So you are having these kind of seminars or webinars on a regular basis? Is it a monthly event or? Yeah.
Now we are, I mean, we started the webinars. Well, we previously had roundtables, conferences, at least once a month, normally 2 times a month. Sometimes we go over, we have 3, well, we adapt our calendar to, you know, to the opportunities. Sometimes when people were coming through Brussels, we were doing something. Now, you know, we got into the webinar form, and probably we will stay quite some time because it is also very convenient. I mean, the last webinar we had before an academic in Australia, you know, from Sydney.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It would not.
No, I think this episode will have long-term consequences for all of us, including that one. And we will travel less. I'm sure we will travel less and communicate more.
Yes,
which is something we see also at the university. You know, we are now teaching online, and I think it will continue.
Your tutorials, your thesis tutorials work well with this online format.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, for foreign students, I can see that at Sciences Po, but also at King's College, even more at King's College. It is so expensive to stay in a city like London. If you can get the degree by following courses online, for Indian students especially, makes a big difference. So that may be a turning point in that sense.
Yeah, I think
absolutely, yeah.
It's also quite practical to have lessons online. I don't know if everyone shares. Christophe, did you get the shared
file?
I
think that nothing can replace a direct contact.
No, of course. That's the problem, because we may think that it's the same, but it's not the same. It's not the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, you've sent me a Google Drive, haven't you, Anna?
Yes, I sent you.
Okay, so let me look at my Google Drive in that case.
I sent you access to the document.
Okay, let me see. And we begin anytime you want, huh? Because
we'll just wait another 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Just to
Yeah, I will be just on time when there will be when 1 o'clock will.
Yeah.
Loading registration. Okie doke. And then
I could not attend. I was very sorry. Faisal's presentation. I like him very much. We are friends for years, but I had to teach on that day, and
but we have the recordings of all the webinars in our website.
that's good. That's very good. So in fact, yes, if you can send me the link, that will be very, very nice. And also, of course, the link for mine. I will tweet.
Of course.
I will send it on Twitter. Which address have you used? My Gmail account?
The one we've been using, but
Okay. So it should be there.
It should also, if you refresh, maybe now I sent you a PDF on the thread of emails, since it's a.
Okay, here it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has just arrived. Very good.
So now you can.
That's very easy.
That's easier. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is.
Just
even though the letters are very small, but I can read.
Perhaps you can.
Yeah, a bit too small. Yes, I already.
I'll manage. I'll manage.
to have bigger. Yeah, I already said that to Albino, but it would be a good idea to change it. Yes, I really asked that yesterday because when you reach a certain age.
Yeah, exactly. You need help.
Yeah, I do need as well. Yeah, exactly. So it's not really convenient. It's good to remind Albino. I actually asked him yesterday on a bigger format. Well, so the time has come. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We have the pleasure of launching a new webinar, this time with the distinguished Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. We have really a very high number of attendees. We are available here in Zoom for those who inscribe themselves, and I believe as well through Facebook, open to everyone that wants to join our webinar. South Asia Democratic Forum, we are a think tank based in Brussels. We are the only Brussels-based think tank that is dedicated exclusively to South Asia. And of course, within South Asia, we have been giving attention to a lot of countries and a lot of issues. But of course, India is the most important from all points of view of the South Asian countries, and this will be dealt with today. Those who want to know a bit more of SADF, please feel free to navigate a bit on our website. I think that you will find everything you need to know. We are very keen on publishing works from, well, academics or public in general that want to share their views according to our rules in our publications. You can visit our notes to contributors to see how you can do it. We are very fortunate to have a very impressive number of high-ranking personalities, mostly in the academic area, but as well some of them in think tanks, in administration. And one of them is exactly Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. He is, well, he's French. He is very well, very much connected with a very well-known Sciences Po Sciences Politiques faculty in Paris, but he is also teaching a bit everywhere. I think from the King's College to Yale to Columbia, Princeton. I mean, it's really really a very big number of universities. You are a very famous academic and very reputed on South Asia. You have a very extensive work on it. We are very much indebted to you for having accepted to be in our board of advisors and to have accepted to be here today with us. Thank you very much, Professor Christophe Chaffelot. The webinar today will be moderated by our researcher and advisor, Hannah Madatali. She will now get the floor and will conduct the work till the end. We will have our next webinar is going to be a webinar. It's going to be next week. It's going to be a shared initiative with a Nepalese-based, Kathmandu-based think tank. It's also going to look at the consequences of the present pandemic and the way that both European Union and South Asia are trying to overcome it. We are still setting the details. I think that most likely the time will be, it's going to be on Thursday next week. So it's going to be on June the 4th. Most likely it's going to be 11 Brussels time. That means 14 hours 45 Kathmandu time. But the details are not yet settled down. But if you consult our website tomorrow, I think that the information will be there. And those of you who want to participate, you are very much welcome. There will be people coming from participants. It's going to be the round table. We will have a European presence. Another member of our board of advisors will be present, and myself and people from Nepal and India. It's going certainly to be very interesting, but you will have to consult our website to see the final details because we are still arranging them. So without further delay, please, Anna, take the floor. Thank you so much for the preparing and for getting all this webinar going. Please, Anna.
Well, good afternoon to everyone joining. Good afternoon from Brussels to everyone, those joining us here on Zoom and those via Facebook. It is a privilege to welcome Dr. Christophe Chaffelot and to give a bit more of context to Christophe's expertise on the subject on which he will be speaking. He is well known by everyone interested in contemporary South Asian studies, and he has written and edited a number of referential works on the contemporary history of India and Pakistan. He is the director of the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po Paris, and he is also permanent consultant at the Center for Policy Planning staff of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2008. I hope I got everything right. Christophe has been described by fellow South Asianists as one of the most prolific, insightful, and deeply informed analysts of Indian politics and society, and one of the world's leading scholars on the profound transformations shaping India's extraordinary democracy. So before I pass on the floor to Dr. Chaffelot, a small note on the Q&A. You will be able to pose questions through the Q&A mechanism here on Zoom, but when you do so, please do state your name and affiliation so that we can present you when we pose your question. So without further delay, Christophe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, just before I start, I need to say that I'm not the director of CERI anymore in Paris, but I was for 8 years, and that was a great experiment, I must say. Another preface, this is the PowerPoint I'm going to show is based on a forthcoming note that I have just written for a French think tank, Institut Montaigne, that has followed what is going on in South Asia and in Asia in general in a very intensive manner over the last few years. And for the details, therefore, I will really refer you to the website of the Institut Montaigne, Montaigne Institute. This will be available, the note, my note will be available on this website sometimes next week. So let me share the screen now and show the slides I want to show to you. I will try to keep it like that so that you can see everything. The point I want to make in this presentation is in reference to this COVID-19 crisis, the fact that it is in fact making visible trends which were already palpable or not so prominent, except for those who were really close observers of India. And this, at least in 3 domains, we'll have no time, I'm afraid, to look at political issues, except in the Q&A, of course. But the 3 domains I am focusing on today are public health, social inequalities, and economic tensions. Tensions is a word you will qualify by yourself when you will see the details. I spent most of my time on these economic dimensions, which are so important today. Health issues. I'll be brief on that ground because the pandemic in India for the moment is not of a huge magnitude. Only, quote unquote, 160,000 cases today, a little bit less than that, in fact. Only, quote unquote, 4,500 deaths so far. These numbers are not very big given the size of India's population. But there is a caveat to this assessment, and it comes from the fact that the number of daily additional cases remains above 6,000. It is not diminishing, and the curve is not flattening. If you look at this select number of countries, you see that India is now like Brazil in a way, with a curve that is not flattening. This graph is a little bit old, but the change is only very minimal. The number of cases doubles, sometimes like every 10 days or so, which is of course disturbing given 2 or 3 issues. Number one, the number of tests remains rather low. And these tests are sometimes unreliable. We are very surprised sometimes to see huge variations in one state, in one city. Testing stops or slows down. But if we go by the official figures, the number of tests anyway is low. 1.8 tests per 1,000 Indians compared to 8 per 1,000 South Africans, for instance. That's one caveat, which makes the assessment of the pandemic more difficult. The second caveat, is more than a caveat, in fact, is that if the pace of the pandemics remains the same in the coming weeks, the peak will not come before July, and by then, the number of infections will be probably in hundreds of thousands. And last but not least, already there is a challenge because of the number of active cases that is above 80,000 already. Very interestingly, these data are not emphasized. We focus on the number of cases, the global number, the full number, when in fact, what is very important in the case of India is the number of active cases. For one simple reason, the state of the public health system does not enable India to handle too many active cases. And this is why this pandemic is revealing of a longer trend, something that it goes beyond the actual present day situation. In fact, it is revealing of the fact that India has a public health system that is not up to the mark. There are only 700,000 hospital beds in India, 0.7 per 1,000 people against 2.2 in Brazil, 2.8 in South Africa, 4.2 in China, 5.2 in Cuba, 6.5 in France, and so on and so forth. Not only that, but you have only something like 70,000 intensive care units beds, which means that the 80,000 active cases that you have today would not fit if they were in need of, let's say, ventilators. There are only something like 40,000 ventilators in public hospitals. So we see the challenge if the pandemics continue. And this is a reflection of the fact that India has never invested much in public health. 1.2% of the government expenditures of the budget of the Indian Union, that's really little. But as you can see there, I'm somewhat speculating on future, you can say, health-related issues. I don't want to speculate only on the future. I want to deal with the present day situation and the real crisis. And the crisis is not health related today. It's social, it's humanitarian even. And that is largely due to the fact that in March, on the 24th of March, the lockdown that has been announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi was rather drastic, even draconian. Factories, shops, markets were shut down, transport services were discontinued, the supply chains were all broken, making the life of peasants very difficult too, because they could not sell their product anymore. And that was the most visible part of the social tragedy. Millions of migrant workers who had lost their jobs and therefore could not pay for their rent left the cities trying to return to the village where they were coming from. And the number is very difficult to assess, but for sure, millions, dozens of millions of people were on the road or trying to get back to their village by train when they started to work again, the Shramik trains, which are back on the railway lines. The total number of people who have lost their jobs, according to the CMIE, the best sources, one of the best sources today, is above 122 million, including something like 91.3 million daily laborers, people who have no contract, who are not on any payroll. This is, of course, the reflection of another long-term trend, that is the role, the place of the informal sector in the Indian economy. 80% of the Indian economy is in the informal sector. And the unemployment rate jumped, according to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which I repeat is one of the best sources. It jumped to something like 27%, which is, of course, unique in the history of the country. Very interestingly, CEOs of big Indian companies, including Anand Mahindra, acknowledged that the informal sector, in fact, made the life of the formal sector very complicated in this context. And Anand Mahendra, in a very interesting tweet, said, many parts of our supply chain are today handicapped by the lack of loaders and loaders, mainly migrant workers. This pandemic has shown us that they are key elements of our ecosystem. We never paid them much attention. We now need to respect them as they are as key support pillars of society. I return to this in my conclusion because for me it's one of the lessons that we are learning from this crisis. But a lesson we knew before because the World Bank had already told India 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, you need to create salaried jobs. You need to extend the safety net that the salariat gives to workers. And of course, that was not followed by any policy. Why is it such a big problem? Well, it's a big problem primarily because there is no safety net for the migrant workers, for the informal sector workers, and therefore they have no social security, of course. They have no savings. In fact, according to CMIE, again, 50% of Indians cannot survive more than 1 month without working, without any wage, because they have no savings, hardly any saving. And that's why the social crisis turned out to be a humanitarian crisis. And that's why NGOs were so useful, because they were the ones who could give food in addition to the state government and other official agencies to these poor people when they could not go back to their village. This is a reflection of the imbalances of the economic pattern, the growth pattern of India over the last 3 decades. In fact, you add something like growth without development, in the sense that the growth rates, which were very high till very recently, above 8%, sometimes 7%, were not used for investing in any welfare state activities, at least not sufficiently. Of course, the UPA government between 2004 and 2014 developed the right to food, the right to education, but the money supporting these rights was very little, except for one project, the NRAGA, to which I may return in the Q&A if you want. But lately, that had not been sustained. And therefore, you add a growth pattern, you add a, you can say, an equality-based growth pattern. Inequalities increased very dramatically over the last few decades. And when a crisis like the COVID-19 crisis happens, all of a sudden, it becomes not only a social crisis, but also a humanitarian crisis for that very reason. That is also due to the fact that agriculture had been in crisis for a long time, for many reasons, including the fact that 70% of the peasants has less than 1 hectare to cultivate, plus water issues. As a result, agriculture represents 55% of the workforce and only 16% of the GDP. And this is why, for the first time in the history of the National Sample Survey Office, the percentage of Indians living below the poverty line has increased. So before the COVID-19 crisis. And that's the point I want to emphasize. Indian society, after years of growth without development, was very vulnerable in social terms. And that made the crisis not only social, but also humanitarian. And the newspapers, after sometimes had to echo this change. Poverty was back. And that's not a post-COVID article, it's a pre-COVID article that shows that indeed the idea that India was an emerging economy, was modernizing, had to be qualified, because at least in the countryside, in village India, the situation was worsening. What has been the response of the government in this context? Well, the first relief plan has been announced by Narendra Modi on March 27. It was a very small one. It was represented less than 1% of the Indian GDP. And that's why it had to be followed by another one. On May 12, he announced this time a relief plan that he said represented 10% of the Indian GDP. That figure, these figures have been qualified by most of the observers, and for two reasons. First, this relief package included the huge infusions of liquidity by the Reserve Bank of India that had taken place in the previous weeks. And secondly, most of the second relief package consisted in loans, guarantees, loans, liquidities again, and mostly to small and medium enterprises. So all the experts, including Indian and foreign experts, considered that in fact the fiscal package was again not more than 1% of the GDP. It's a problem not only because little money is going in the pocket of the Indian poor, but also because the money that is lent to the bank, I mean, the liquidities that the banks now have may not translate into loans so easily to the economy. And that's something we saw very quickly. One of the co-founders of the Wire, M.K. Venu, said, as of May 5, over 8 lakh crore rupees of bank funds invested back with RBI at 3.7%. Banks are not lending at all to distressed micro, small, and medium enterprises, credit freeze. Why is that? Why don't the bank use the liquidities they are now submerged with? Well, for one very important reason. That takes us back to another of the weak points of the Indian economy pre-COVID-19, the non-performing assets. The non-performing assets of the public banks have risen to such an extent that now they represent more than 10% of the gross advances, which means that banks do not take the risk of lending the money they get. They prefer to park it with the RBI. And that's a very important point to make, because the finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, herself had to repeat 3 times, do use the money you now get to make loans. She said that to the bankers to no avail, it seems, which is another reason why the package is not sufficient. Incidentally, this is a reflection of another issue that is very obvious on these graphs, if NPAs have been such a big problem for the Indian economy, it's also because savings were declining, and without savings, it's more difficult to lend money, and that's one of the reasons also why the investment rates was declining for years. So one more indication of a long-term trend. The Indian economy was also in a bad shape before the COVID-19 crisis on these two fronts, savings and investments. Why can't the government spend more? You can argue that it's a kind of commitment, a supply side economy oriented commitment, and that's perfectly convincing. The government believe in the entrepreneurs, wants to make them stronger instead of giving the money to the consumers. Well, that is one dimension of the problem. There is some ideological commitments behind that. But first, enterprises, businessmen ask for more money in the pocket of the consumers because they say the demand is so weak. Why should we invest if there is no demand? And secondly, the government could spend more and help the Indians financially, not only because of some need on the demand side, but also because of the humanitarian crisis that is now so clear. So why don't the government of India doesn't spend more? Well, first of all, because again, the pre-COVID situation was not very good. The growth rate was down, and as a result, the fiscal deficit of India was already close to 10% of the GDP. India was not in the same situation last month when Narendra Modi announced the first relief package than Manmohan Singh when he had to react to the first big crisis, the 2008 crisis that he had to face. At that time, he could spend a lot from the exchequer because the fiscal deficit was rather low. It is twice larger today, and therefore the government of India has its hands tied up to a certain extent. If the government cannot relaunch the economy by spending more with a substantial relief package, the economic crisis ahead is bound to be very severe. If you go by the recent announcements made by Goldman Sachs, for instance, the Indian economy will contract by an analyzed 45% in the second quarter from the previous one, the first one, and by 5% for the 2021 fiscal year. And as Goldman Sachs said, this would be deeper than any other recession India has ever experienced. These figures, incidentally, are very similar to the ones the State Bank of India have just published, saying that the economy would contract by 6.8% on 2021 for 2021, which is even more than what Goldman Sachs has said. The social impact is bound to be the return of mass poverty, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative for the UN has just announced and predicted that 260 million people in India would be pushed into poverty again after many years of either reduction of poverty or limited increase of poverty, as we could see on the NSS graph. What is the Indian government doing if it is not taking care of the present day situation in terms of public expenditures? Well, it is thinking in terms of structural reforms. And this is probably the most understudied and the most interesting aspect of the policies of the Modi government these days. The government of India and also some states governments are interested in using the crisis, the COVID crisis, as an opportunity for making structural reforms, which is not so surprising. India reformed structurally only at the time of crisis. It did in 91, it may do it again today. What are the structural reforms in the pipeline? Well, I would mention 4 before closing. The first one comes from the speech Narendra Modi made on the 12th of May when he announced the second relief package. Self-sufficiency, the idea that, as he said, it's time for India now to be self-reliant. Self-reliance meant probably something we saw before, more protectionism. And again, a long-term trend was already visible before the COVID-19 crisis. India was more and more protectionist. But this time, the leap forward in the same direction has been illustrated by the fact that in April, almost 1 month before Modi's speech, the Indian Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade had revised its foreign investment policy, making prior approval of the government mandatory for investment activities, including mergers and acquisitions, from countries that share a border with India. Of course, China was a target. India wanted to protect its businesses from Chinese takeovers. That's one dimension of the self-reliant quest, or the self-sufficiency quest. And it went together with a huge investment in the pharma sector. India realizing that it was depending upon Chinese active principles to make medicines, and therefore trying to emancipate itself from these dependencies by investing in the pharma sector. Well, can India be self-sufficient? Can it be self-reliant? Can it close its borders to foreign investors? Well, maybe the Chinese ones only, and even though that's it needs to be also qualified. But the Chinese investors may be the ones who will be less welcome in the near future. At the same time, Make in India is continuing as a program, and the Indian authorities have announced recently that they were now in a position to offer to foreign investors land twice Luxembourg's size. The foreign investors targeted by this offer being mostly the ones who were in China and would withdraw from China and reorient their investments. So self-sufficiency, yes, but in the context of a new Make in India program, I think. The other structural reform that is accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis, and I repeat, accelerated, because again, there's nothing new. This crisis is just a catalyst. It is amplifying, accelerating trends which were there before. This one is related to privatizations and what is known in India as disinvestment. The disinvestment formula reflecting a policy of withdrawal of the state from the public sector. That was already in the pipeline. In February, when she was presenting the yearly budget in Parliament, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman had already announced that a large number of public sector undertakings would be privatized, including Air India, or would have their capital open to private investors. And that was the case of the life insurance company, a huge PSU of 1 million agents. That was in the pipeline, but the present deepening of the fiscal deficit is, of course, accelerating the privatization plans. So now there is, and again, the finance minister has announced this in the context of the second relief package, a public sector enterprises policy that lists the strategic sectors, and there should be no more than 4 public sector enterprises in these strategic sectors. The rest would be merged or privatized. If this is implemented, that may make the Indian, you can say, route to credit capitalism broader. Already, we know that there are very few private companies which are in a position, both financially and politically, to buy big public undertakings. And these big companies are already, in many cases, oligopolistic. A very interesting graph that The Economist published this month showed that 20 Indian companies account for nearly 70% of the total earnings of the Indian private sector, against 14% 30 years ago. What does it say? It says that already you have big players controlling sectors, telecom, gas, refineries, and they may become even bigger because they are the ones who are in a position to acquire more resources, more strength by buying public undertakings if they are privatized. Third, the agriculture also has been targeted, selected by the government of India for structural reforms. And the Modi government in particular intends to amend the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act and also the Essential Committees Act in order to deregulate trading practices in the agricultural markets. Peasants would be allowed to sell their products wherever it is valuable for them. Barriers to interstate trade in agriculture would be lifted, and contract farming would be introduced in such a way as the buyer can assure a price to the farmer at the time of sowing only. Well, this liberalization of the agriculture sector has been hailed by some observers as the 1991 moment for agriculture, 1991 being the time when the industry and the services had been liberalized in India. It remains to be seen how that can apply to agriculture, partly because this is a state subject to a great extent, and some states have already liberalized. In fact, this is not new. Again, the present crisis is not making anything new. It is just amplified older trends. And in the cases of states like Bihar, the benefit for the peasants have been very limited. But I don't go into the details there because I'm now a bit late, and we can return to that in the Q&A. Last but not least, that's also a structural reform. Some states, BJP ruled states, all of them, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, have seized the opportunity of this crisis for reforming the labor laws and for exempting industrialists from most of the labor laws. Uttar Pradesh is certainly the most ambitious state, so to speak, in this context. The Uttar Pradesh temporary exemption from certain labor laws ordinance has suspended many laws, retaining only 4 important labor laws. One of those which are supposed to be suspended are the Minimum Wages Act, the Maternity Benefit Act, the Equal Remuneration Act, the Trade Union Act. The list is very long, and I don't want to read them all. It's an ordinance. It will have to be passed into a law, and it's not for sure. It's not for sure because, you know, very ironically, the trade union, the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, that is organically linked to the BJP and to the Sangh Parivar at large, has protested against such a move, saying that they were rare even in most undemocratic countries. And the head of the BMS wrote to the chief ministers saying that they may have to agitate against these labor laws. The prime minister, the government of India will inevitably will have to step in this debate. But if this is implemented, it will be definitely a structural change in the Indian economy, justified, of course, I'm sure you get the point, by the need to attract investors from abroad in particular. So what is the way out? What is the next step? And we need to return to the present day situation for assessing the solutions. Because loans and structural reforms may improve the situation in the long term, but as a very good economist who had something to say in a similar crisis in the interwar period, Keynes said, in the long term we'll all be dead. And that's why you need to do something for those who want to survive now. That's something, by the way, Raghuram Rajan has also said very recently, the former RBI governor. He said, loans take time. The work of the loans take time. And structural reforms take even more time. So Nobel Prize economists, including Amartya Sen, Banerjee, said the same. Fix the problems of today first, and the problem is how. Well, India needs to spend more, and probably we'll have to use some of its huge foreign exchange reserves for that. Plus, India will have to borrow from foreign lenders. And that's something Chidambaram, the former finance minister of India, said recently. If you don't borrow, you don't have a proper relief package. Well, India can borrow to some extent because its debt ratio is not yet alarming, and it can probably alleviate its dependence vis-a-vis bilateral donors by getting more money from multilateral donors or lenders. The World Bank has already given $2 billion to India. The Asian Development Bank has already given $1.5 billion to India. That is probably part of the solution. India was not willing to receive some aid since Vajpayee, since the Vajpayee years. The idea that India had to receive some aid was not very well perceived. India preferred to help others, like in the tsunami crisis, than to be aided. But time have changed, and this crisis is a game changer. That's a graph that gives you an idea of the debt to GDP ratio of India. It's not very good, but it's not that bad. So to borrow money is probably the next step. And then, and I'll stop with this slide. Then I would say three variables, very difficult to predict, will decide whether the economy will be back on its feet quickly or not. First, there'll be a third relief package, and that's probably why, the government of India has not spent too much now, thinking that it will need more money in the future, and that's probably when the foreign exchange reserves will be used. But again, what will this relief package look like? How big will it be? Will it be demand oriented this time for a change? Question mark. Secondly, there is a big question mark regarding the migrant workers. As Anand Mahindra has noticed, they are key to the Indian industry. Now they are back to their village. They have had a very bad experience, to say the least. Will they return to the city? How quickly? Question mark. And last but not least, how will the state governments and the union government work together? No, there were tensions. There were tensions with the state governments directed by opposition parties because of political competition. West Bengal was a case in point. Because of fiscal unfairness, quote unquote. These are the words of southern chief ministers who resented the way their states were subsidizing northern and western states, including Gujarat. These tensions may get exacerbated. They have been to some extent. When Narendra Modi decided the lockdown without consulting the chief ministers, that was something that exacerbated the tensions with some of the opposition state governments. These tensions may also be exacerbated because some of the chief ministers, opposition chief ministers in Kerala, Rajasthan, Punjab, Chhattisgarh, are dealing with the crisis rather effectively compared to BJP ruled states. So that may not make the situation easier. In fact, the center may also be affected because it's easy to say or to see that the policy has been the cup of tea of the state governments, and you can say policies at large, when the center was doing politics, and you can even say spectacle politics, tamasha, something that can affect the reputation, the credibility of the union government. At the same time, and I'll end on this note, that will be my only political note. At the same time, there are very few chief ministers who can really capitalize on these developments, and they are not competitors to Narendra Modi, who probably will continue to appear as the strong man India needs and to mobilize the nation of emotional issues. This is very much in tune with what we've seen in other countries where the credibility of the policies or the lack of credibility of the policies of the leaders have not resulted in a decline in terms of popularity. And this is the beauty of populism, of course. But I'll stop here because we need to keep some time for the Q&A, and I will stop to share the screen for that purpose.
Thank you, Christophe, very much for your talk. I think we can keep spotlighting Christophe's video as I'm not answering the questions, but we have a question from Professor Radha de Souza from the University of Westminster, where she teaches international law and development. And her question is, what will be the impact of the workers returning to the villages on the structural changes you have outlined? Secondly, what plans does does SADF have on future activities? I think I'll answer that by the end, and Christophe can answer his question.
Well, the return of the migrant workers to the villages, as I said, is one of the variables very difficult to predict. The impact in the short term will be devastating for one simple reason. These migrant workers, if you go by the figures Tariq Tachil is giving, sent back to their families in the villages between 1/3 and 1/2 of their wages, monthly wages. These additional resources have now disappeared. So can they invest their workforce in agriculture and help sufficiently their family by doing this kind of job? Or will they go back to factories when they'll be reopening? As I said, it's a question mark. It's a question mark. If I had to make any recommendation, I would recommend a massive investment plan in agriculture in India, irrigation, for instance, in order to keep this workforce in the village and in order to make agriculture much more productive. But I'm not an economist, first of all, so that's my real personal suggestion. And secondly, I'm not sure India is prepared to invest in agriculture, partly because they have little money for that, also because nobody has for so many decades. Agriculture has never been a priority for the UPA government, except in terms of the NRAGA and for the NDA government.
Thank you. We have a question also from Rosa Maria Perez. She's an anthropologist professor at ISCTE University of Lisbon Institute. And she says, I have carried out research with Dalits in Gujarat. I am a member of the Dalit Studies Group, whose members report almost on a daily basis a double segregation, social as it always was, and now another one triggered by COVID-19. Can you comment on this? And then she has, on another note, apparently the Minister for Science of Kerala has enhanced the public health policy, which has drastically contained contagion. Is this information reliable?
That's a very good point. I'll comment upon the last point first. Kerala has done well. If there is a model today among the Indian states, it's Kerala. And it's Kerala because they have, again, in the long term, for many decades, invested in some welfare programs, including public health. So we see that that was the right thing to do, in contrast to states where the public health system has been abandoned and people have relied on the privatization of health. So rich states like Gujarat are now lacking the public hospitals they need and that Kerala still has. Plus, very important, in Kerala, there is a sense of decentralization that makes the reactivity of the administration much more effective. And this it's not only true for health, it's true for other bureaucratic activities. Dalits in Gujarat, well, Dalits in India at large are of course affected by an additional problem in the context of this COVID-19 crisis. Not only they are overrepresented among the migrant workers, laborers who have lost their job, but because of the stigma of untouchability, because of this old, very old discrimination, the moment you invite people to social distancing, the target are the Dalits. I mean, the first, you can say, collateral casualty is the Dalit. In fact, they should have used a different word. Social distancing in the Indian context rings bells, which are particularly devastating.
Okay, thank you. We now move on to India, where Kumud Watri from Amity University in Gurugram, India, asks, as a policy expert, one, what is your opinion for bringing economic reliance to India in global context? Two, can contract farming potentially provide a vital support to agrarian economic reforms?
Yeah, these are good questions, very good questions. On the first question, I really don't see how India can somewhat leave the world now in terms of economic interactions. This is the trend, and that's why, by the way, India last year abstained from joining the RCP, the regional cooperation grouping that China is, of course, aiding more or less. But that was badly resented by partners, including Japan, who considered that India would have been very much useful and would have benefited from such an inclusion, because that would have helped India to reform its economy to be more competitive. This is the problem with protectionism. The moment you insulate your economy from international competition, the incentive to innovate, to invest, to do R&D declines. So for that reason, India should not leave the world economically. At the same time, it makes a lot of sense to retain or to regain some of the strategic autonomy that India needs. It's very clear, for instance, that India cannot be depending upon China for medicines or for many other key equipments, including the telecom sector, for instance. So the response would be selective in your protectionism, in your quest for self-sufficiency, self-reliance. And that's what the predecessors of Narendra Modi have done, by the way. Incidentally, this idea of self-reliance is the Nehruvian idea par excellence. No? Of course, Modi will never say that he is imitating Jawaharlal Nehru because he is his bête noire. It's because of Nehru that India is in such a bad shape today. I am sure you know. Well, that's what Nehru did to some extent. He invited Americans, Germans, Japanese to develop IITs. And at the same time, he was protectionist, a little bit too much protectionist, but still, he was selective. The second question on contract farming is a very interesting one. I'm not at all an expert. My assumption is that some regulation should still be there for protecting the peasants from the agro-food business. Who will invest? Who will invest and sign contracts with peasants? The usual suspects, those who have deep pockets and can spend money and give contracts even at the time of sowing. Who can do that? No, we know very well how the vertical integration that is in the making will allow Reliance to be the main player from the sowing to the marketing and to the selling of the product. Well, when such oligopolistic companies are in the fray, some regulation is necessary. And we saw that also when the crops insurances scams emerged in the past few years. So yes, that may be a good way to help the peasants to modernize, to invest themselves, but with some regulation, and you may even say debate in Parliament before this law is passed, because these debates sometimes are eye-openers. You may have forgotten, but the first big bill that the Modi government tried to introduce about the land acquisition in 2014 resulted in a very important debate in Parliament, and at the end of the day, they had to give up. So parliamentary debate on such an issue is highly recommended.
Thank you. We have questions raining in. I apologize to our guests if we're not able to address every single one. If you've posed two, then we'll try to address at least one. So we have Mritika from JNU University in Delhi, who says, certainly, sir, India is pushing towards protectionism policies, but then the entrepreneurs and startups neither have the sufficient monetary packages nor labor to flare up the production process. The very India of making India a vocal campaign could be a flawed project. Do you share, please do share your views on the same.
Yeah, no, but we are back to the selectivity notion, the notion of selectivity that I highlighted before. And the response is in the question, really, because if on the one hand, the entrepreneurs do not have the resources, how can you close your doors to those who will be investing from outside? You need some investments, at least some minimum investments. But there is a third party there. And this is, again, a very understudied subject. But why are so many big companies, Indian big companies, parking their money abroad? Why are so many rich Indians allowed to invest abroad? If India needs badly investments in IT, in so many domains, it's not only agriculture, of course, far from that. Here you have a real issue that is not studied at all, but you have with the big business houses not only the problem of crony capitalism, oligopolistic attitudes, but also the problem of where do they invest, if at all. And that is something you will see probably very soon when the NPAs will become such a sensitive issue that they will have to be dealt with. So what do you do with the big companies which are responsible for at least 25% of these NPAs? Are they allowed to go bankrupt and then sell their assets for refunding the banks, or are they bailed out again and again? This is, I think, the crux of the matter. So yes, to protect the market is important, but to protect the big capitalists of India may not be the best policy.
On that note, we have two questions that are related or at least connected to one another. We have one from Jude Lal Fernando from Trinity College Dublin, and she asks, what are the geopolitical implications of protecting the market from China? How far will India get closer to the UK, USA axis through structural reforms? And then we have another question from Dr. Siegfried Wolf, our Director of Research at the SADF. And he says, by stepping up border transgressions, do you think Beijing is exploring the worsening coronavirus pandemic situation in India to draw a red line for New Delhi not to pursue further its integration policy of Kashmir, as well as challenging Chinese national interests, such as the One China principle, territorial demands in the South China Sea, or demanding an independent investigation of the corona outbreak in China?
Yeah, these are good questions again. You know, the problem, so far as the first question is concerned, with the Indian-China relations. Yes, India is now willing to emancipate itself from Chinese influences. Mm. But it's not easy to find alternatives in some domains. Now, half of the smartphones that Indians use are made in China. Where else will you find the alternative source for so many manufactured products? Secondly, can the US and UK invest in India in such a way that they make China redundant? No, if India turned to China for some of these products, it's also because the Make in India program did not attract so many Western investors. And the trade dispute with Donald Trump is not over. The problems Vodafone is facing in India because of Jio is showing that, well, this is not a really free market economy. So can UK somewhat swallow this and invest more in India? Again, I do think that India will have to be very selective to try to regain its autonomy vis-a-vis China in key sectors, and pharma is one. At the same time, India will not be able to do without China, because the West will not rescue India to such an extent economically that it will be feasible. Incidentally, it's true of many other countries. Europeans are living in a fantasy when they think that they can just sever the links with China in so many domains. They can't. Game over. The point of no return has been reached. So now we have to be selective and not dreamers when we think about how do we regain our autonomy vis-a-vis China. On the present day military tensions between China and India in the Himalayas, it's not easy to correlate that to any ongoing developments. Certainly, China is upset by the way India is behaving in Jammu and Kashmir, is behaving in the WHO, but it's not necessarily the reason why they are now deploying troops in Ladakh. In the past, in Doklam, next to Bhutan, in many other places, you had this kind of somewhat encroachment by Chinese PLA soldiers that were not easy to correlate to other issues. Even in 2014, when Xi Jinping was invited by Modi for the first time in Ahmedabad, they were together talking to each other in Ahmedabad when PLA forces invaded India, as if the right hand did not know what the left hand was doing, or as if it's not because you talk with Chinese that Chinese are not pursuing long-term agendas. And that's my main conclusion. You don't need to look at the circumstances, the context for making sense of Chinese expansionism. Chinese expansionism is on the agenda anyway. And sometimes there is no direct relation with the day-to-day activities of diplomats or politicians.
Thank you. We have, sorry, we will keep going for a bit more. Are you okay with answering a few more questions?
Yeah, a couple of more questions, not more than that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in Lisbon and a question in France, which go hand in hand. The question from France is from Nicolas Ravaik, who asks what can be the enhanced in EU-India further cooperation. And we have a question from Lisbon, from Farnaz Keshavji, researcher in social psychology, who says, from your presentation, I get the impression that the catastrophic scenario that you have presented, instead of it to be blamed on the pandemic, it is rather part of an already planned governmental strategy, and that in fact, COVID-19 will be used as the scapegoating for something that was already taking place in Modi's government. We already know that these humanitarian crises will eventually impact the rest of the world, and Europe will not be exempt from its own share and co-responsibility. What do you envisage could be the policy European countries should establish in their relations with India?
Well, the two indeed are connected. At least the end of the second question arcs back to the first question. But I would begin with another aspect of the second question. Yes, politics continues at the time of a humanitarian disaster. It's not because you are facing such a huge humanitarian crisis that you don't do politics. Politicians do politics in each and every circumstances. So this is seen as an opportunity for pushing a long-term political, ideological, economic agenda. Yes, there is a kind of consistent attitude there. Mm-hmm. It's just accelerating. That's the key word of this crisis. This crisis is accelerating things which were already palpable. Now, what do the EU and India do together? Well, many things. The first thing, of course, and we are back to China, is to resist the new Chinese attitude. Well, not so new in a way. If you want to summarize it in few words, might is right. No, at least India and the EU believe in multilateralism, the rule of law. They should joint hands for fighting in this direction, for making multilateral institutions more resilient. WHO is one of them, definitely. And India and the EU will have to resist not only China, but also the US. One wants to take over the organization, the other one wants to leave the organization, but to fight for a multilateral order is definitely something India and the EU can do together. And of course, there is more in the pipeline, but there is more in the pipeline for years. There is one thing that India and the EU are bound to do, to sign a trade agreement. If they could achieve that, they would really make a qualitative difference. And third, but last but not least, India and the EU should work for a multicultural agenda where we would stop using minorities as scapegoats, something many European countries are very good at, something India is better and better at, to such an extent that in the context of the COVID-19, when Muslims were seen as responsible for the pandemic, Arab countries had to step in and denounce, I quote, Islamophobia of the Indian government. Well, the values India is supposed to cultivate, secularism, multiculturalism, tolerance, are the values the EU is supposed to cultivate. And there was, by the way, a debate in the EU Parliament about the capacity of India to contain sectarianism and communalism. That's something nobody speaks about these days. Human rights is not supported by anybody publicly these days, but in the world of today, there are two big political entities, India and the EU, whose DNA used to be rooted in these values. And it's not because a crisis like this one is becoming a huge challenge that these values should be abandoned.
Thank you very much. I think we will not massacre you anymore, but thank you very much for answering to all of these questions. I think I speak for all of the members of the SADF team when I say that we hope to have the opportunity to hear from you many more times. I said to Faisal Devji, it is not goodbye, it is au revoir. And I am very pleased that our au revoir will be very soon. As you said, from Keynes, on the long run, we're all dead. So it is on the 15th of June that we meet again together with Dr. Faisal Devji, our executive director, Paulo Casaca, and the head of division for the South Asia division of the European External Action Service, Caroline Vino, for an interesting conversation on, how can academics inform policymakers and vice versa. So thank you very much, Christophe, for making the time.
Au revoir then.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.